In the autumn of 1852, a schoolhouse stood at the edge of the northern timberline, its clapboard walls blistered from seasons of harsh wind and unbroken silence. No road reached it directly, though a trail of rutted wagon tracks wound in and out of the birch stands like a half-remembered path. The school's windows were always shuttered, even on the brightest afternoons, so that no passerby could glimpse the chalk diagrams that covered the walls from floor to ceiling. The children, all 21 of them, arrived before dawn each day, and did not leave until the evening bell sounded. They did not bring books from home or recite lessons aloud. Instead, they spent their hours sketching elaborate maps on coarse yellow paper, maps that never resembled the township or any known territory, but which always contained the same peculiar markings: an arched gateway drawn with a broken line, a series of looping arrows, and an area in the corner, labelled only with a single word: nowhere. Before we go any further, I'd like to know, where are you watching from tonight, and what hour has found you there? Let me know in the comments. The first person to notice the children's maps was a circuit preacher named Reverend Darren Bell, who rode out to the schoolhouse after hearing reports that the pupils had stopped speaking to their families altogether. When he stepped inside, he found the children seated in perfect stillness, their pencils moving across the paper in slow, deliberate strokes. None of them looked up when he called out. He walked between the rows of desks, studying the details of their drawings, each map different in its winding shapes and cryptic symbols, but all sharing that same final destination: nowhere. Reverend Bell gathered several of the sheets and brought them to the township clerk, hoping that someone might recognize the landmarks or decipher the curious legend. But no one could say where the broken arched gate might stand, or why so many arrows converged upon that single unmarked space. When the Reverend returned to the school the next day, he discovered every desk had been neatly emptied and every child gone. By the time the sheriff organized a search party, the first snow had already drifted over the children's tracks. A few men claimed they spotted faint impressions winding north, toward the gullies where the creek vanished underground. Others argued the footprints were only animal, deer or stray dogs crossing the clearing in confusion. The townsfolk gathered at the schoolhouse porch each evening, listening for any sign of return. But the valley remained mute, the trees locked in their winter hush. On the 7th day, a farmer's dog brought back a scrap of parchment in its teeth, damp and nearly shredded. The paper bore a familiar pattern, a looping line, a broken arch, and the word nowhere smudged across the bottom corner in a child's unsteady hand. No other trace of the children ever surfaced, as though the maps had carried them beyond the township's reach, into a place that could not be charted by any compass or recalled by any living memory. Some whispered that the maps were nothing more than the fantasies of restless minds, stirred by isolation and the long dark of northern winters, but others remembered a different story, one told by the eldest residents, who spoke of a settlement that predated the county records. They claimed there had once been a hamlet tucked along the same ridge, a place that vanished without formal notice or farewell. The story went that the settlement's last inhabitants spent their final season drawing strange diagrams on their cabin walls, as if convinced that mapping their passage might anchor them to the known world. When the cabins were found, every surface was marked with the same sign, a broken arch standing over an emptiness no one could name. Whether this tale was memory or myth, the resemblance to the children's sketches was enough to quiet the most skeptical voices. Even the sheriff stopped disputing the maps, though he would never admit it aloud. Weeks passed, and the schoolhouse fell into neglect. Snow piled high against the door, sealing in the hush that had settled over the place since the children disappeared. No one volunteered to clear the drifts or mend the roof. When spring came, a pair of surveyors were sent to inventory the property for the county. They expected to find nothing but broken desks and mildew. Instead, they discovered the walls freshly covered in new drawings, dozens of maps rendered in neat black strokes, unspoiled by damp or weather. Each showed a different path winding away from the schoolhouse, some spiraling back upon themselves, others branching like veins across the paper. But all ended at that same crude archway. One surveyor, overcome by curiosity, tore a map from the wall and folded it into his coat pocket. He did not stay to see the other man pause in the doorway, struck still by some detail he never found words to explain. The surveyor who carried away the map returned to his boarding house that evening, pale and subdued. He laid the folded paper on his bedside table and refused supper, telling his landlady he felt unwell. At dawn he was gone, no note left behind, no trace of departure except for the map, which remained precisely where he had placed it. A constable who came to examine the sheet remarked that the ink appeared darker than before, as though it had been freshly applied during the night. When he lifted it to the window, he noticed new markings that had not been described in the surveyor's ledger, a series of tiny footprints winding along the path, each step minutely detailed, their course veering away from the arch for the first time. They ended at the margin of the page, where the fibres had frayed as if worn thin by repeated touch. Some believed the surveyor had simply lost his nerve and slipped away under cover of darkness. Others suspected he had followed the map to its conclusion. Over the following months, rumours of the vanished children spread across the neighbouring counties. Travellers came to peer through the warped panes of the schoolhouse windows, hoping to glimpse the fabled drawings. Most saw only the sagging desks and the scatter of yellowed papers underfoot, but a few claimed that if you stood in the doorway at dusk, the walls appeared almost luminous, the lines of ink glistening like veins beneath skin. One itinerant teacher insisted she watched the maps shift in the half-light, the paths elongating and folding over one another as if they were alive. She left before sunrise and never returned, though she told an innkeeper that she had glimpsed her own name written near the broken arch. By midsummer, no one would enter the schoolhouse at all. The county erected a crude fence around the lot, more a gesture than a true barrier. And still, the stories persisted, accounts of soft footsteps in the frost and scraps of paper drifting across the fields at dawn. The last official record to mention the schoolhouse came in the form of a single paragraph, buried near the back of a county ledger, a notice of condemnation, citing structural decay and public hazard. No reference was made to the children, the surveyors, or the dozens who claimed to have seen the maps transform in the dark. After that entry, the building vanished from formal mention, as though the township had quietly agreed to forget it. Yet travellers passing along the old wagon route still reported glimpses of a small white structure tucked between the birch trunks, its roof intact despite years of abandonment. A woman delivering letters claimed she heard singing from inside, a soft chorus of young voices rising and falling in a language she could not name. She did not stop to investigate. No one did. Even now, the children's maps resurface from time to time, pressed between pages of old account books, or folded into the corners of estate inventories, each bearing that same destination inked in a trembling hand, nowhere. In the summer of 1855, a travelling tinsmith named Ephraim Broom arrived in the valley, intent on finding the old schoolhouse and satisfying a curiosity that had grown into an obsession. For months, he had collected scraps of testimony, snippets from farmers, coachmen, and the occasional parish clerk, each recalling the children's maps in solemn, bewildered tones. Ephraim believed there was a pattern to the drawings, some hidden geometry that, if properly traced, would reveal why so many had vanished. He kept a ledger of his own, filling its pages with copies of every map he acquired. But no matter how he arranged them, the paths never aligned. Each map began in a different place, as if each child had carried a separate fragment of the same journey. When he reached the rise above the schoolhouse clearing, he dismounted and stood for a long while, studying the warped boards and the dark gap of the doorway. The wind stirred the grass at his boots, and he thought he heard the echo of small voices repeating a lesson he could not understand. Ephraim stepped inside, his boots sinking into the brittle drift of old papers that carpeted the floor. The air held a scent of mildew, and something fainter, like chalk, rubbed smooth between small fingers. He moved slowly along the walls, where the drawings had faded to pale tracings in the wood grain. Some marks were no broader than a hair, a delicate lattice of lines that seemed to deepen if he stared too long. He spread his own copies across a broad desk, matching each against the ghosts of the originals. For hours, he measured angles and distances by lantern light, murmuring calculations under his breath. At last he noticed a detail he had missed before, a series of tiny crosses arranged along the margins of several maps. No other versions he'd seen bore these symbols. As he traced them with the tip of his pencil, he felt a hush fall over the room, a hush so complete, he was certain someone, or something, was listening to the scratch of graphite on parchment. Night settled over the clearing, and Ephraim lit a second lantern, unwilling to leave before he understood what the crosses meant. He worked methodically, marking each point on a fresh sheet. When he connected them, the shape that emerged struck him with a cold clarity he could not deny, a likeness of the valley itself, bounded by the ridge to the north and the dry creek bed to the east. At the center of this crude map, the broken arch appeared once more, sketched in careful proportion. But there was something else, an inscription he had never seen in any other version. Just beneath the arch, in the smallest hand, were two words: "Follow me." The letters seemed freshly inked, as if waiting for him alone. Ephraim sat back, the lantern trembling on its hook. He tried to convince himself that some child's hand had written the phrase decades earlier, but the doubt settled in his mind like a stone. He closed his ledger and folded the page away, telling himself he would study it by daylight. Sleep did not come easily in the schoolhouse. Ephraim lay wrapped in his travelling coat, the lantern burning low on the desk beside him. Every few minutes, he thought he heard a faint rustling, paper shifting under an invisible hand, or footsteps pacing in the corners, where the shadows pooled deepest. Once he sat bolt upright, convinced a small shape stood just beyond the doorway, watching him. But when he raised the lantern, the darkness resolved into nothing but warped boards and drifting dust. At dawn, he rose stiff and hollow-eyed, determined to leave before the place unsteadied his mind any further. Yet as he gathered his things, he found the folded page he had marked with the crosses was missing. He searched the floor, turned out his satchel, and checked every crevice between the desks. It was nowhere. He left the schoolhouse empty-handed, but when he reached the rise above the clearing, he paused to look back. In the slanting light, he thought he saw fresh maps covering the walls, gleaming as if just drawn. Ephraim did not speak of what he had seen when he returned to the township. He took a small room above the cooper's shop and kept to himself, emerging only to collect supplies or mail. Neighbors whispered that he had grown unwell, his eyes hollow, his voice reduced to a hoarse murmur. At night he was seen pacing before the window, a lamp in his hand and a sheaf of papers clutched tight against his chest. Some claimed he had begun drafting maps of his own, though no one ever glimpsed the pages directly. The cooper's wife said she once heard him muttering a phrase over and over, his voice thin with exhaustion: "Follow me, follow me." On the third week of his stay, Ephraim disappeared as quietly as the children had. His room was left in meticulous order. Only the lantern on the sill remained lit, the flame guttering in the dawn wind. No trace of the missing page was ever recovered, nor any record of where he went. In the years that followed, others tried to reconstruct Ephraim's collection. A scholar from the county seat made a careful inventory of the remaining maps, hoping to uncover some common thread among them. He catalogued each sheet by its most distinctive feature: arrows, footprints, branching paths, then compared them line by line. No two were identical, but certain patterns recurred like a half-buried refrain, the looping lines converging near the broken arch, the placement of small symbols in the margins. He noted how often a single word or phrase appeared at the terminus of the path: "nowhere," or in a few cases, "follow me." The more he studied the collection, the more convinced he became that the drawings were not the work of childish fancy. They held a purpose, even if it lay just beyond the reach of language. When he closed the final ledger, he found his hand trembling and could not say whether it was from fear or fascination. He left the schoolhouse without looking back. By the time the century turned, The schoolhouse was little more than a husk. Its roof bowed under the weight of countless seasons, yet the stories clung to it like frost. A traveling peddler who camped nearby claimed he saw a procession of children file through the doorway at dawn, 20 or more, silent and barefoot, their faces hidden by the fall of their hair. He did not dare call out. Instead, he lay in the grass and watched as they moved into the building one by one. When he found the courage to rise, the place was empty again, the door swaying slightly in the breeze. He later described the moment as a kind of waking dream, but his eyes betrayed something harder to dismiss, a glint of certainty that no amount of reason could soften. Those who heard his tale did not mock him. The valley had long since taught its residents that some stories were best met with quiet acceptance, rather than argument. In time, the clearing grew wild with birch, saplings and brambles, swallowing the last traces of the path that had once led to the schoolhouse door. The township stopped marking the building on any map, yet even as the structure decayed, new accounts emerged, children who returned home after wandering too far afield, their pockets lined with folded scraps of yellow paper, each bearing the same meticulous script. Some were too young to explain where they had found them. Others insisted they had followed a trail of drawings pinned to tree trunks, the ink so fresh it smudged beneath their fingers. When the papers were collected and compared to the surviving maps, the resemblance was undeniable. The same broken arch, the same delicate arrows leading deeper into blankness. In the township records, the phenomenon was noted in the language of polite disbelief, unverified reports, anecdotal accounts, probable hoaxes. But among those who had seen the children's eyes upon their return, there was little appetite for dismissal. In the autumn of 1872, a young woman named Agnes Holt arrived in the valley under a pale, drifting rain. She claimed she had come to tend her late uncle's property, but many believed her true purpose was to find the schoolhouse. Her uncle, after all, had been the clerk who catalogued the first collection of the children's maps, and rumour said he died clutching a sheaf of them in his hands. Agnes carried only a single trunk and a canvas portfolio strapped tight with cord. She took a room in the inn at the township's edge and asked discreet questions of the hostler, the miller's wife, anyone who might recall the clearing. Though most were reluctant to speak, a few offered guarded directions, fragments of old roads, the memory of a crooked birch that marked the final turn. On her third evening, she was seen departing alone by lantern light, her boots already thick with mud. No one witnessed her return. Agnes was not seen again for nearly a week. When she reappeared at the inn, her face was hollow, the skin beneath her eyes drawn tight and grey. She refused all questions, retreating to her narrow room without a word. The innkeeper's wife, roused by a noise in the night, later claimed she heard Agnes speaking softly to someone behind her closed door. The voice that answered, low and childlike, did not sound like any guest she knew. By morning, Agnes had departed, leaving behind her trunk and the canvas portfolio she had guarded so closely. The innkeeper, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and dread, unfastened the cords. Inside lay dozens of fresh drawings. Each was rendered in a precise, practiced hand, the lines so dark they appeared almost wet. Unlike the older maps, these bore no looping arrows or cryptic symbols. Instead, every page displayed the same image repeated over and over, the archway standing alone in an empty field, waiting. The drawings were shown to the township magistrate, who examined them in silence. He had no desire to make a formal record, nor to involve the county authorities. Instead, he ordered the portfolio sealed and placed in the courthouse storeroom. But the innkeeper's wife, unsettled by what she'd seen, began to tell a different version of the story. She claimed that on the final morning, Agnes had paused in the doorway and looked back over her shoulder, her eyes dark with some private understanding. In a voice that scarcely carried, she was said to have whispered that the maps had never been meant to guide anyone away. They were invitations, she said, drawn not to escape nowhere, but to return to it. Whether this recollection was true or merely an embellishment, no one could say for certain. But in the weeks that followed, the courthouse staff reported hearing the storeroom door creak open and shut at odd hours, though the keys never left the magistrate's pocket. Late that winter, a deputy assigned to inventory the courthouse storeroom found the sealed portfolio unbound and the contents rearranged. Every drawing had been placed in a single stack, as if prepared for someone to collect. He gathered the pages and counted them twice. Where there had been dozens, only 21 remained, the same number as the children who had vanished decades earlier. A cold draft moved through the narrow room, though no window stood open. The deputy shut the ledger and stepped into the corridor, trying to steady his breath. Later, he would confide to the magistrate that, in the hush before he fled, he heard the unmistakable scrape of a pencil moving across paper. No official report recorded this claim. The magistrate simply had the portfolio locked inside the courthouse vault and forbade any further mention of Agnes Holt or her drawings. Yet stories trickled out all the same, as stories are wont to do, carrying the shape of that archway into every home that dared listen. When spring came, a mason tasked with repairing the courthouse foundation discovered something no record could explain. Beneath the flagstones, embedded in the soil, lay fragments of parchment, dozens of torn corners and curling edges, each bearing the same inked lines. He gathered them in a burlap sack and delivered them to the magistrate without a word. The magistrate examined the pieces, noting how they seemed to form parts of larger drawings, paths coiling in on themselves, small figures rendered in a delicate hand. In the center of each fragment, the same phrase repeated like an incantation, "Follow me." He ordered the pieces burned in the iron stove, and the mason watched in uneasy silence as the flames consumed the brittle paper. But in the weeks that followed, workmen complained that new scraps appeared in the mortar at dawn, unmarked by soot or age. No one dared collect them. They were left where they lay, small invitations pressed into the courthouse walls. By midsummer, the magistrate fell ill. Those who attended his bedside said he roused only to murmur half-formed thoughts of arches and fields, of children who waited in the dark, with blank faces and outstretched hands. He died before the harvest, and no successor cared to reopen the vault that held Agnes Holt's remaining drawings. In his final days he had given one last instruction, that the courthouse door be locked each night, with 3 separate keys, each held by a different official. Even so, the night watchman reported seeing a slim figure slip through the entryway just before dawn, vanishing beyond the threshold without a sound. When he described the shape to the constable, his voice trembled. He insisted the figure carried a lantern, and that its light illuminated a face he recognized. The young woman who had brought the drawings to the township, her expression neither sorrowful nor afraid, simply resolved, as if she had found the path she had sought all along. After the magistrate's passing, the courthouse fell into neglect. Weeds choked the steps, and the shutters hung loose on rusted hinges. Yet no official dared declare the building abandoned. Couriers still arrived with sealed envelopes, though no one could say who sent them. Inside, the vault remained locked, its contents undisturbed, or so the township believed. On an autumn morning dense with fog, the watchman failed to appear for his rounds. A clerk sent to fetch him found the man's lamp still burning beside the entrance. Near the flame, a sheet of parchment lay folded with careful precision. When the clerk lifted it, she felt the cold bite of ink still wet to the touch. The drawing was simple, a single line looping in on itself until it formed a perfect circle. Beneath it, in letters so faint they might have been etched by a needle, was a single word "nowhere." The clerk did not open the vault. She turned and left without extinguishing the lamp. By the first snowfall, talk of the courthouse and the vanished watchman had become something close to legend. Children dared one another to peer through the warped shutters, swearing they glimpsed figures moving inside. The townsfolk, weary of speculation, began to pretend the building did not exist at all. But stories have a way of persisting in quiet places. In winter, travelers crossing the valley often spoke of lights flickering behind the courthouse windows, steady and deliberate, as if someone within still worked by lamplight long after midnight. A drayman passing at dawn claimed he saw a row of figures standing along the corridor, each holding a slip of yellow paper. He said their faces were pale and unlined, like children carved from wax. When pressed, he admitted he could not recall whether they watched him as he passed or kept their eyes on the drawings in their hands. Either truth, he said, seemed worse than the other. The courthouse remained closed after that final inspection, though it was said the magistrate's seal never held fast again. Each dawn, the door stood slightly ajar, as if some invisible procession had passed through in the night. Though no official returned to the place, curiosity festered in the township like a buried infection. In spring, a young surveyor named Owen Callahan came from the county seat, hired to prepare a fresh appraisal of the property. He was not a man given to superstition. His training had been rigorous, his temperament methodical. On the morning of his visit, he arrived alone, carrying a new ledger and a set of brass instruments wrapped in oilcloth. The neighbors watched from their porches as he crossed the threshold without pause. He would later record that the building's silence felt purposeful, as though it listened for each footstep. Inside, the air was dry enough to catch in the throat. Dust lay so thick across the floors, it looked like snow in the dim light. Owen moved room by room, measuring the distance between the walls, noting the lean of the ceiling beams. He found no sign of recent occupation, no footprints, no scattered papers. Only in the main hall did he notice something that unsettled his practiced calm. Faint tracks crossing the dust, small and narrow, like the impressions of children's bare feet. He crouched to examine them, and saw that each print had a peculiar clarity, the toes and arches rendered with almost delicate precision, as if whoever left them had paused just long enough for the dust to settle around every contour. He rose and continued his inspection, telling himself it was nothing more than the mark of vagrants. Yet when he reached the old vault, he discovered the iron door swung open to reveal a hollow darkness. His lantern threw its light into the space, and for a moment he thought the vault was empty after all. But then he glimpsed a shape set precisely at the center, a single sheet of yellowed paper resting on the stone floor. He hesitated, the back of his neck prickling as if watched. At last he stepped inside and stooped to retrieve the page. It was a map, rendered in black ink so saturated it shone like oil. Unlike the older drawings, this one bore no winding paths or looping arrows, only a simple outline of the courthouse itself, sketched with unerring accuracy, and a series of small crosses placed around the perimeter. At the very heart of the structure, a symbol he did not recognize, an arch formed from two broken lines, crowned by a single word in cramped lettering, nowhere. As he turned the paper over in his hands, Owen felt a hush descend so complete that he heard his own pulse echo against the stone walls. It was not the quiet of abandonment, but something nearer to attention, as if the building itself had been waiting for him to find this final fragment. Owen slipped the paper into his ledger and backed out of the vault, unwilling to remain in that hush a moment longer. He closed the iron door behind him, though it resisted as if caught on some unseen obstruction. When at last it shut, a small tremor travelled up his arms and into his chest, a reminder that the courthouse was older than memory here, older, perhaps, than the township itself. He told himself again that all he had found was a relic of old stories, a scrap left behind by the curious or the frightened. But as he stepped into the corridor, the lantern's glow flickered against the walls and revealed something he could not ignore. Fresh marks etched into the plaster, running in a wavering line along the baseboards. He approached cautiously, lantern raised high, and saw the line was not random after all, but a procession of tiny arches, each drawn with a trembling hand. There must have been hundreds of them, looping in an unbroken sequence from the vault to the front door. Some were no bigger than a thumbnail, others as wide as his palm. At intervals, a word repeated beneath the arches, though the script was so thin he could hardly decipher it. He knelt and traced one line with a gloved fingertip, the letters blurred beneath the touch, smearing into the dust. Only when he stepped back did he make out the repetition, like a chant or command. Follow me. The thought came unbidden that this was no map at all, but an invitation, left by someone who expected an answer. Owen felt the cold sharpen in the hall, as though the winter had crept through the walls to listen. He straightened, his hand pressed over the folded page in his ledger, and realized he could not bring himself to look behind him. Some childish instinct insisted that if he did, he would see the arches still forming on the plaster, drawn by a hand he could not name. He left the courthouse without further note, locking the main doors with the old iron key the magistrate's clerk had entrusted to him. As he descended the steps, dawn edged across the rooftops of the township, softening the hard lines of the buildings. Yet nothing in that pale light touched the courthouse itself. It stood in a hush so deep the world seemed to skirt around it, like a memory no one wished to hold. When Owen reached the street, he did not look back. Even so, he felt the gaze of something fixed upon him, as patient and enduring as the ink on that single page, waiting for the day he would decide to follow. Owen returned to the township's inn, where he was known as a courteous man, given to early hours and quiet conversation. But when he came in that morning, pale and unshaven, the innkeeper's wife did not press him with questions. She saw the way he carried his ledger clutched tight to his chest, and she understood the look in his eyes, the same hollow certainty she had glimpsed years before in Agnes Holt. He went directly to his small room beneath the eaves, and did not emerge for 3 days. On the second evening, a stable boy delivering firewood claimed he heard voices behind the closed door, not the measured mutter of a man speaking to himself, but the overlapping cadence of many voices, high and low, weaving together in some urgent exchange. When he pressed his ear to the panel, he made out a single phrase repeated again and again, until it no longer sounded like words at all. Nowhere, nowhere, nowhere. He dropped the bundle of wood and fled without knocking. When Owen finally descended the stairs, he looked rested in a way that frightened those who watched him. His eyes were clear, his expression resolved. He paid his account in exact coin and offered a polite farewell, as though nothing unusual had passed. Before he left, he pressed a sealed envelope into the innkeeper's hand, instructing that it be delivered to the county office, should he fail to return within a fortnight. He did not say where he was going, but everyone understood. The path needed no declaration. That night, a fog thicker than any in memory rose from the low fields and crept through the township lanes. Some who lay awake claimed they saw a solitary figure crossing the square, a lantern held steady against the murk. At times, they insisted, a second light flickered beside the first, smaller and dimmer, as if a child walked beside the surveyor, bearing its own fragile flame. No one approached to see for certain. By dawn, the fog had lifted, revealing nothing but the rutted track leading to the old courthouse and the prints of a single pair of boots in the frost. The courthouse door stood open, wide enough for any passerby to glimpse the darkness within, but no one stepped over the threshold. In the weeks that followed, Owen Callahan's envelope remained unopened in the county office. No official dared break the seal. Some claimed they heard the words inside, even through the heavy paper, whispers so soft they could never be repeated, and so clear they could never be forgotten. The envelope lay in the county office for nearly a season before a clerk named Samuel Dent found himself alone one evening, unable to ignore the way it seemed to pulse in the lamplight. He had told himself for weeks that he would leave it untouched, that whatever confession or instruction waited inside belonged to a matter far beyond his station. Yet as the wind rose beyond the windows, rattling the shutters against their frames, Samuel felt a pressure behind his eyes, a subtle insistence that he see for himself what the surveyor had left behind. His hands trembled as he slipped a blade beneath the seal. The wax cracked with a brittle finality, and for a moment he closed his eyes, bracing for some unknown consequence. But no rush of cold air or shadow came pouring from the fold. Only a single sheet of paper emerged, thick and yellowed, the ink on its surface so dark it shone like a fresh wound. The drawing was simple, a circle rendered with meticulous care, bisected by a single arching line. Around its edge, tiny figures were arranged in a procession, each no taller than a fingernail. They held lanterns aloft, and though no faces were drawn, Samuel thought he could feel the pressure of their gazes. Beneath the image, a brief note had been written in a hand steadier than any he had seen from Owen Callahan. I have found the way. It is not a place. It is the memory of a place, and it remembers us in return. He read the words again and again, each repetition hollowing him in some essential way. Though he could not have explained why, he knew he must not let the letter remain in the office. With the care of a man handling a sacred thing, he folded the paper and placed it in the breast pocket of his coat. He did not record his action in the ledger, nor did he leave any sign of what he had taken. When he extinguished the lamp and stepped out into the chill darkness, he felt the wind turn against his cheek as if to guide him. Later, when the county clerk returned to find the envelope gone, he assumed a simple theft and filed no report. It was only much later, after Samuel Dent's name joined the growing list of those quietly vanished, that the ledger was consulted again. But by then the pattern had long since become familiar, an inheritance passed from hand to hand, unbroken as any bloodline. In the hush that followed, no one spoke aloud the suspicion that had begun to sprout in every mind, that the maps were not merely records of a journey, but the means to continue it, one soul at a time. Weeks passed before anyone thought to search Samuel Dent's small rented rooms above the cooper's shop. When the constable and 2 witnesses entered, they found the space undisturbed, as though he had only stepped out for a moment's errand. His supper plate sat clean on the shelf, his coat neatly folded on the foot of the bed, but the ledger in which he kept his private accounts lay open on the desk, its last page filled edge to edge with a precise looping script. No one could say whether the handwriting matched his. The letters were smaller than any he'd used in life, so fine they seemed almost to quiver in the lamplight. The constable bent close and read a single phrase repeated in unbroken lines from top to bottom. Nowhere is not empty. Nowhere is waiting. Though the words might have been a cipher or a symptom of madness, the men in the room did not attempt to decipher them further. They closed the ledger and left it where it lay. On the floor near the bed, a sheaf of yellowed pages had been arranged in a fan, the edges aligned with deliberate care. Each bore a single drawing, the broken arch framed by darkness, the tiny procession of figures holding lanterns aloft. But on these, a new detail had emerged. Where once the faces of the figures had been left blank, now each was filled in with unsettling precision. Some were young, some lined with age, but all wore the same expression, an open-eyed stillness that made the skin crawl to behold. One of the witnesses, a man who had served as the township's undertaker for 30 years, turned away and refused to look again. He swore under his breath that he had recognized 3 of the faces among the crowd. Outside the cooper's shop, the street remained hushed in a soft winter dusk. Children hurried past with their heads down, clutching their parcels close. Though no proclamation was ever issued, the constable nailed a length of timber across the door, as if closing a room where sickness had once taken root. In time, the tenants forgot who had lived there last. Yet those who had stood in the doorway that day never forgot the chill that seeped from the walls, nor the sensation that someone unseen watched them from every corner. In the months that followed, the drawings dispersed as if by unseen hands. One was found folded into a parish ledger, another surfaced among the household papers of a family who swore they had never known Samuel Dent. Each time the ink appeared newly set, as though the page had only just been completed, and always, at the margin of the drawing, a single line returned like a heartbeat. Nowhere is waiting. As spring crept back across the valley, the stories began to slip once more into rumour. Half-believed recollections shared over alehouse counters, and in the low hush of parlours after dusk. Most townsfolk preferred to think of Samuel Dent as another man who had simply wearied of his lot and vanished into the world beyond the ridge. But for those who had seen the drawings firsthand, the explanations never sat clean against the mind. Among them was Lydia Markham, the schoolteacher, who had once dared to copy the children's maps before the courthouse vault was sealed. She had kept her reproductions hidden for years, pressed between the pages of a devotional she never opened. But as the season turned, she found herself taking them out each evening, studying the brittle sheets by lamplight. The lines seemed to shift as she traced them, rearranging themselves into patterns she could almost, but not quite, recognize. Sometimes, in the earliest hours before dawn, she felt sure that if she only closed her eyes, she would know the path to the place they described. One night, overcome by a feeling she could neither name nor resist, Lydia took a piece of charcoal to a fresh page and began to draw. Her hand moved without conscious direction, guided by an impulse that felt both foreign and intimate. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, her breath shallow. The drawing was different from any she had seen. It showed no arch, no winding trails, only a small house with a lantern burning in its window, and a solitary figure standing before the threshold. The face, rendered in a delicate, unflinching line, was her own. For a long time she did not move. She watched the lantern in the picture, as if it might flicker of its own accord. A thought, cold and certain, settled into her mind. The maps did not merely record where others had gone, they foretold where she would go herself. She folded the paper, set it beside the older drawings, and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, her heart beat steady and calm, as though it had at last found its proper rhythm. At dawn, Lydia Markham packed her few belongings into a canvas satchel. She left her door unlatched behind her. When neighbors saw her walk the road that led to the courthouse clearing, they did not call out or follow. They watched in silence until her shape dissolved into the mist. Days later, a single slip of paper was discovered on the stoop of her cottage, weighted by a small stone. The drawing it bore was no larger than a child's palm. A house, a lantern, and an open door. Beneath it, in that same fine hand, 3 words had been added in ink so black it gleamed: "Nowhere is home." Summer settled over the valley, in a hush so complete that even the birds seemed reluctant to break it. The days unfurled in long, stifling hours, the sky a pale, unblinking eye, over fields gone brittle with heat. It was in this stillness that the last inquiry into the matter of the vanished maps was quietly begun, a private undertaking rather than an official one, led by a man named Nathaniel Greaves. Greaves was a scholar by reputation, a man whose career had been built on the cataloguing of vanished settlements and the superstitions that flourished in their absence. He arrived in the township one August afternoon, his carriage packed with crates of ledgers and delicate instruments, the brass fittings glinting like coin in the sun. Those who glimpsed him through their parlour curtains noted the narrow set of his mouth and the pale hunger in his eyes, as if the quiet of the courthouse had been calling to him long before he crossed the county line. He took up residence in the old parsonage, a house that had stood empty for over a decade. Each evening as the heat began to fade, he walked the road to the courthouse, carrying with him a lantern and a satchel of papers. In the first week he made a careful survey of the building's perimeter, recording each crack in the foundation, each scrap of parchment that drifted from the door at dawn. At night he studied the notes by lamplight, comparing the shapes and measurements to the maps preserved in county archives. In the small hours when even the crickets fell silent, he found himself tracing the lines again and again, certain that if he could just fix his gaze long enough, some hidden principle would reveal itself. On the 14th evening he gathered the courage to step inside. The air was cool after the oppressive heat of the day, scented with old paper and a deeper, more metallic tang he could not identify. He lit a second lantern and set it on the broad desk where so many had left their accounts unfinished. The flame cast a trembling light over the walls, and for a moment, Greaves thought he saw the plaster breathe. He reminded himself that fatigue played tricks on the senses, but when he moved closer, the illusion did not resolve. Along every surface, fresh marks had bloomed, hundreds of them, scrawled in overlapping patterns, as though 100 hands had been set to work in the hours since sunset. He bent close, feeling his breath catch as he studied the nearest cluster. There were no arches here, no winding paths, only a single phrase, repeated until the letters bled into one another. "It remembers." Greaves' lantern flickered as though stirred by a hidden wind. He turned in a slow circle, the words swimming in and out of sight on every wall, until he felt his balance begin to slip. He steadied himself against the door frame, the heat of the iron leaching into his palm. Somewhere beyond the threshold, the darkness seemed to pulse with a slow, waiting awareness. He forced himself to look away, to close the ledger in his hand and step back onto the porch, where the air tasted of dust instead of iron. That night, he did not sleep. He sat in the parsonage kitchen, the lantern guttering low, and sorted through the records he had assembled over the years. Accounts of lost villages, orphaned settlements, places that had slipped from the map with nothing but a rumor left behind. But none of them, he realized, shared the peculiar consistency of this place. The same images, the same words, returning decade after decade, finding new hands to record them. Even in the most superstitious corners of the territory, stories changed as they passed from mouth to mouth. Only here did they remain fixed, precise, as if they belonged not to memory, but to something older and more deliberate. Just before dawn, he laid his pen aside. In the hush that followed, he realized the fear that had haunted him since his arrival was not the fear of the unknown. It was the fear that the courthouse, and the darkness within it, knew him already, that in some small and perfect way, it had been waiting for him alone. He pressed his hand flat over the most recent map, feeling the faint grit of the ink beneath his skin. The lantern's light glinted off the fresh lettering. It remembers. The words seemed to thrum against his palm, as if the page itself held a pulse. In that moment, he understood that no measure of scholarship would ever disentangle what had taken root here. The maps were not records, nor invitations, nor warnings. They were a declaration, a simple, inexorable fact that each person who touched them carried away, sealed behind their ribs like a second heart. When he stood, his knees ached with the hours he had spent bent over the desk. The lantern's wick had burned to a tiny ember. He did not light another. Moving by memory, he packed away his papers, set his instruments in order, and opened the parsonage door. The street beyond lay empty, a pale seam between darkened houses. For the first time in weeks, he felt a calm settle over him. He turned toward the courthouse. Its roof rose against the paling sky, an unbroken silhouette that seemed to breathe with the slow certainty of the earth itself. Lantern in hand, Nathaniel Greaves began to walk. Greaves crossed the square as the first swallows stirred in their nests along the eaves. The hush was so complete that the clink of the lantern's brass fittings sounded unnaturally loud. Each step carried him nearer to a threshold he had long believed he would only ever describe from a safe remove. Yet the moment he reached the courthouse steps, he felt no impulse to hesitate. He placed the lantern on the topmost tread, watching its glow spread across the warped boards of the door. The latch lifted beneath his hand without resistance. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry earth, as if the walls had drawn in all memory of warmth. Greaves closed the door behind him, and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The hall appeared empty at first, though the shadows seemed thicker than they should have been, curling in the corners like a slow exhalation. He moved toward the old vault, passing the place where generations of constables and clerks had paused to weigh their courage. The iron door still hung open, and the darkness within looked denser than the dawn light behind him could account for. He stepped to the threshold and raised the lantern. Its glow spilled across the vault floor, revealing a single sheet of paper resting in the exact center of the room. He knew, even before he stooped to retrieve it, what it would show. Yet when he lifted it and turned the page toward the light, he felt something inside him recoil. The drawing was so finely rendered that it seemed to hover between illusion and reality. The courthouse itself, etched in precise lines, each window and warped plank, caught in unflinching detail. But this time, the view was not from without, as in the older maps. It was from within, looking out past the doorway, past the steps, toward the empty square, where a lone figure stood watching. Though no features were drawn on the face, he recognized the angle of the shoulders, the slight bow of the head. It was himself, standing in the same dawn that now seeped through the cracks of the courthouse walls. Beneath the image, in letters that looked as if they had been inked only moments before, the words waited. "You have always been here." Greaves set the paper back on the vault floor. He did not trust himself to hold it any longer. His hand trembled as he pressed his palm flat against the threshold, feeling the cool stone as a kind of proof that he still inhabited his own body. But the thought, unbidden, slipped into his mind with a final quiet certainty. There would be no leaving, not in the way he had imagined. He thought of all the years he had spent tracing the patterns of lost settlements, how he had believed, in his secret vanity, that knowledge would inoculate him against the pull that had claimed so many before him. The old stories had always ended the same way, no matter how diligently he catalogued their details, with a door left open, a lantern guttering on a sill, a page marked in a hand no one could ever quite identify. He wondered, in that moment, whether any of the vanished had truly crossed a boundary into some other place, or whether the maps were only a means of revealing that they had never been separate from it to begin with. A shiver moved through the vault, a hush so profound it seemed to press against the skin. He rose, turning back toward the hall, and found the darkness waiting there, thicker than before, shaped now by the faint suggestion of motion, as if dozens of unseen figures shifted just beyond the edge of his vision. The lantern in his hand sputtered and flared. In its last surge of light, he thought he glimpsed the outline of a narrow arch, formed by the curving backs of countless bowed heads. Then the flame died, and the hush deepened until it became the only thing he could hear. He did not cry out. There was no fear left in him, only the sensation of something vast unfolding, a darkness not empty, but filled with a patient knowing. The maps had never been instructions. They were confessions, left behind by those who had discovered that nowhere was not a destination, but a recognition that the walls of the courthouse were only the outer skin of a hollow already lodged in the heart. Nathaniel Greaves did not emerge from the courthouse again. In the weeks that followed, the township learned of his absence in the usual way, through a neighbor's observation that the windows once shuttered stood open to the night. No search was mounted, no inquiry filed. The townsfolk had learned, over too many years, that no effort could draw a soul back once it had stepped across that invisible threshold. When a passing driver dared to peer through the doorway one dawn, he claimed he saw a figure standing just within, head bowed in the gloom. But when he returned with others to show them, the hall was empty, save for a scatter of yellowed papers drifting across the floor. Each bore the same line, written in a hand that might have belonged to any of them, or all: "You have always been here." The courthouse remained unbarred through the last of that long summer, its doors drifting open with the smallest wind. At dawn the sunlight fell across the warped floorboards and caught the edges of papers no one dared collect. The townsfolk resumed their quiet routines, but something in the air had shifted, as if the building's hush had seeped into the marrow of the valley itself. Even children who had once run laughing across the square now steered wide around the steps, casting wary glances at the doorway, as though expecting to see a figure watching from within. By September, the stories had resumed their slow, patient spreading, no longer as rumor, but as a certainty spoken in voices too weary to disbelieve. Each account differed in its details, but all bore the same contour: the courthouse, the drawings, the hush that gathered like a living thing. Some said that the maps had grown clearer in recent months, that new pages appeared each night, bearing diagrams more intricate than any before. A drayman swore he had seen a sheaf of them drift from the upper windows on a windless evening, turning end over end like startled birds before settling in the grass. He would not approach to collect them, nor would the parish clerk, who claimed she'd seen the drawings rearrange themselves when no hand was near. Among those who listened, a few began to wonder whether the courthouse itself was the true author of the maps, or if it merely received them, each page a message sent from some deeper hollow beneath the skin of the world. It was a thought few dared to pursue, for it suggested that the building was not a trap laid for the unwary, but a threshold, a place where something patient waited to be named, and that naming once begun would never be undone. In the last weeks before the frost returned, a woman named Eleanor Prentice came quietly to the township. She was no scholar, nor any seeker of stories. Her only claim to the matter was a single narrow grief. Her brother Thomas Prentice had once served as the county clerk, and he had been among the first to seal the vault so many years before. He had vanished within a month of that duty, leaving only a single map behind, an image she had never been permitted to see. Eleanor took lodging in the same parsonage Nathaniel Greaves had abandoned, the shutters still hanging loose on their hinges. She arrived without fanfare, carrying only a carpet bag and a packet of letters tied with twine. For several evenings she sat on the stoop at dusk, her gaze fixed on the courthouse as the windows darkened one by one. Those who passed her path described a stillness in her bearing that bordered on resignation. No one approached to offer counsel. On the night before the equinox, she rose and crossed the square, the packet of letters held against her breast. She paused at the threshold, her palm resting on the warped door. In that moment she felt no fear, only the profound recognition that this was not a place she had come to find, but one that had been waiting for her all along. Inside, the hush pressed close as a breath. The floor was scattered with sheaves of yellowed paper, each bearing the same looping script she had glimpsed once in her brother's hand. The lanterns were long cold. She did not bother to light another. Instead, she moved to the old vault and set the packet of letters in the center of the empty space. One by one she untied the twine and spread each page in a careful fan across the stone. The letters were ordinary in their first lines, accounting of debts, small remembrances, but as she read further, her brother's tone had shifted. He had written of the maps in a language that wavered between awe and dread. Of the moment he first felt the drawings were not inert records, but a kind of memory reaching back toward him. Of the certainty that each person who read them became, in some secret way, part of the pattern they described. In the final letter, he had written only a single sentence, its ink gone thin with age. "I have never left." She knelt there in the hush, her hand resting on that last confession, and felt a stillness settle into her bones. It was a feeling at once unbearably sorrowful, and to her astonishment, almost a comfort, as if her brother's absence had not been an ending, but a long unbroken presence she had never known how to recognize. Some say Eleanor Prentice remained there until dawn, though no witness stepped across the threshold to see. When the sun rose, the courthouse door stood ajar, and the letters had vanished from the vault. No trace of her footprints marked the frost in the yard. Only a single page lay folded on the top step, the paper clean and new as if pressed fresh from the hand of its author. Those who dared approach later would find it bore no diagram at all, only a few plain words written in a hand that might have been Thomas Prentice's or Eleanor's, or someone older still. Nowhere is where you remember what you are. No one ever saw Eleanor again, but in the years that followed, her story joined the others, repeating itself in the hush of kitchens, after the lamps were turned low, in the uneasy glances passed between neighbors who knew better than to dismiss it. For even as the seasons turned and the courthouse roof bowed under the weight of winter, no frost ever touched the threshold, and in that unchanging hush, the maps continued to appear, as patient as breath, waiting to be seen. Tonight you've heard the accounts, fragmented records, fading letters, the soft confessions of those who vanished into a place no map can name. A schoolhouse where children drew paths to nowhere and never returned. A courthouse that stood longer than any memory, its doors open to anyone who dared to look inside. A series of maps that began as harmless sketches and became something more enduring, something that watched and waited across generations. Perhaps you feel a familiar unease now, the sort that flickers at the edge of your thoughts when the house grows quiet and the last lamp has been turned low. You may tell yourself these stories belong to another century, that no old paper or brittle ink could ever reach across so many years to find you. But if you've learned anything from these accounts, it is this: some places are not bound by the seasons, and some memories are more patient than time itself. When the hush settles in your room tonight, when the darkness feels deeper than you remember, ask yourself whether you would recognize the moment when an ordinary door becomes a threshold, whether you would see the map laid before you, or whether you'd already be walking the path it described. And if by chance you find a slip of yellowed paper pressed between the pages of a book you never meant to open, if the ink is dark as fresh soil and the words are written in a hand you almost know, remember that nowhere is never as far away as you hope. Thank you for spending this time here with us. Sleep well if you can, and if you must go looking, be sure you know where your footsteps will lead.